Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Wenn nötig, totale und radikale, als die uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them.
On January 13, 1942, a German submarine appeared off the Atlantic coast of the United States. Together with two others, they took up positions near New York City. The group had just completed 2 weeks of travel. Within sight of the Manhattan skyline, the boats went on the attack. The long-range submarines had an easy time of it. U.S. shipping was completely unprepared, assuming that the East Coast was beyond the reach of the Germans. Unprotected, the freighters were at the mercy of torpedoes.
The Germans, after all, had declared war on the US on December 11, 1941. And then the question was how to actually reach the US. How could they exert an influence on the US? How could they attack it? The only weapon the Germans had for this were their submarines, and Karl Dönitz, the commander of the submarines, was quite pleased with the opportunity to find new hunting grounds for his submarines. He had rightly assumed that the Americans had peacetime merchant shipping on their east coast, and they were of course very easy to attack with submarines. And so he went 5 submarines at first, then more and more to the American east coast and also to the Caribbean. And there hundreds of ships, or about 2 million gross tons, were sunk in the first half of 1942. This was one of the very great successes of the German Navy. Some go so far as to say that this whole Operation Paukenschlag was a second Pearl Harbor.
In einem Einsatzhafen unserer Unterseeboote. Die ersten Amerikafahrer kehren von erfolgreicher Feindfahrt zurück.
Successes like these were most welcome to Nazi propaganda. The newsreels reported extensively on German U-boat heroes.
Kapitänleutnant Hardegen, dessen Boot unmittelbar vor den Toren New Yorks operierte. Kapitänleutnant Hardegen versenkte bisher 110.400 Bruttoregistertonnen, davon 58.000 Bruttoregistertonnen vor New York. Vizeadmiral Dönitz überreicht dem erfolgreichen Kommandanten das Ritterkreuz.
Of course, Nazi propaganda was always looking for images, for stories, for personalizations. We know all this from today's media technology, and in principle, it was no different with Nazi propaganda. What stories can we tell? An infantryman lying in a trench, firing somewhere. That's not a story I can tell. But if I can measure performance, then I can tell stories, then I can award medals. It's like sports. And that's the case with submariners. How much tonnage did they sink? I can measure military performance. That's why submariners are celebrated as heroes by propaganda. I can sell them well. They're young, they're dynamic, they're fighters. They go for it. So I can generate enthusiasm among the youth, unlike the grey mass of the army and the infantry. And the Navy also plays a much bigger role politically through propaganda than it actually plays militarily.
Spielt sie eigentlich auch politisch eine viel größere Rolle, als sie militärisch eigentlich spielt.
On the other side of the continent, America was suddenly threatened by danger from the deep. On February 23rd, a Japanese submarine appeared off the California coast and shelled a refinery near Santa Barbara. For the first time, the U.S. experienced an attack on its mainland. Japan's militaristic government was making propagandistic profit from the foolhardy attack. Ever since the Imperial Navy succeeded in striking a devastating blow against the most important U.S. naval base in the Pacific in December, the Japanese military had been prone to excessive hubris. But exaggerated claims were also being made in the United States.
In the American press after Pearl Harbor, there was actually, of course, exaggerations. But there was definitely this idea that, yes, it's possible that the Yellow Peril is coming. It was possible that the Japanese could also somehow land on the west coast of America. And this fear did exist. As far as the Japanese were concerned, there was never any thought of somehow trying to make a serious landing attempt on the American continent. There were isolated pinpricks on the California coast. That's where the Japanese Navy had sent submarines. But it was more to send the message, if we wanted to, we could reach you. And if we wanted to, we could attack you here. But we're not doing it. It was the same situation with Australia, although there were also those in the Japanese military who said, the next step must actually be to take Australia. We have taken all of Southeast Asia. It's not enough that we bomb Darwin in the north of Australia. No, we also have to take Australia, because sooner or later Australia represents the most important base for the Americans in the Asia-Pacific region.
Using the Blitzkrieg example of their German ally, Japanese troops had quickly invaded numerous countries in Southeast Asia by December. The Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore were also under their control by January. As were numerous Pacific islands. Now, the Japanese were preparing to seize other Western European colonies such as Burma and the East Indies. Asia for the Asians was their battle cry, but for many Japanese nationalists, it served as a mere pretext for these campaigns of conquest.
Japan's plan was first to wage a very offensive, lightning-fast war in Southeast Asia to conquer as much territory as possible, as quickly as possible, in the Southeast Asia-Pacific region. Then to hold on to these in a second, more defensive phase, then to consolidate, and then to force the Americans and also Great Britain and the West into a negotiated peace, if possible, on Japanese terms.
The British Crown colony of Hong Kong fell in early December. Japanese forces outnumbered the Empire's colonial troops almost 4-1. They quickly gained air superiority over the city from the Pearl River Delta. Soon, the Allied formations had to retreat. Then, Japanese troops occupied the city. During the so-called Black Christmas, the civilian population endured immeasurable suffering. Arbitrary murders and rapes by the occupiers were the order of the day. Within 4 months, Nippon brought all of Southeast Asia, as well as much of the Pacific Ocean, with about 450 million people under its rule. The Japanese Empire had never been larger. On the other side of the world, people were highly pleased with these developments, even though no one in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin had known about Japan's plans in advance. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler awarded a medal to the imperial ambassador.
General Oshima hat hervorragende Verdienste das Zustandekommen des Drei-Mächte-Paktes, der Deutschland, Italien und Japan nun auch zum gemeinsamen Kampf die Neuordnung Europas und des fernöstlichen Raumes zusammenschließt.
Oshima had relatively quickly and relatively well ingratiated himself to Adolf Hitler. As Oshima himself had written and communicated, he also had the feeling that he had quite a good connection to the Nazi regime and to Adolf Hitler himself. Of course, we always have a bit of an idea. There was a kind of global Axis warfare. That is, the Axis powers together created a master plan on how to conquer the world and had coordinated it perfectly. It wasn't like that in reality. Even when we think of the invasion of Poland by the Wehrmacht, it is of course clear that the Japanese army looked very closely at what and how the Wehrmacht acted. From the Japanese side, this first Blitzkrieg, which was presented here by the Germans, was studied meticulously and examined at very closely. The Japanese military attaché obtained corresponding reports there and also had them prepared and transmitted to Tokyo. And the Japanese term for Blitzkrieg, Dengekisen, was a literal translation.
In order to defeat the enemy together, the U.S. was portrayed by the Axis powers in a grotesquely distorted manner as a politically unstable and bankrupt country. In actual fact, Roosevelt's New Deal had created an enormous economic boom in the States.
Wenn man die Massen hungernder Untertanen der Roosevelt-Plutokratie sieht, dann begreift man die Furcht der amerikanisch-jüdischen Ausbeuterklicke und ihrer politischen Handlanger vor einem Erwachen dieser Millionen. So geht es den kleinen Arbeitern und Bauern in diesem freien Lande. Im nationalsozialistischen Deutschland sind derartige Verhältnisse undenkbar. Deswegen ist das Ziel der jüdischen Kapitalisten und ihres Roosevelt die Vernichtung Deutschlands. Sie verstecken sich dabei hinter Phrasen und Schlagworten wie Freiheit, Demokratie und menschliche Kultur, die angeblich alle durch Nazi-Deutschland gefährdet seien.
The pictures of the global economic crisis, taken 10 years earlier, were intended to show the supposed state of the nation. Not only was the population led to believe that the American economy was in the doldrums, the Nazi leadership apparently believed this as well.
One of the crucial questions, after all, is why Hitler declared war on the US on December 11, 1941. And it seems that there was something about Hitler's perception at that time in December of 1941, because he believed that the US could not sustain a long war, even economically. On the whole, of course, from today's vantage point, one could make the case that Hitler and many others, the German leadership, the German intelligence service and others massively underestimated the economic power of the United States. There were voices, but only a few, who said that if we go to war with the US, then we can no longer win the war. There were those people. There were also military officers, Fritz Todt, for example, as former Minister of Armaments, who was very critical in the fall of 1941, who said, if the US enters the war, then we have no chance there economically. But most of Hitler's advisors massively underestimated this.
The German arms industry was in full swing. Nazi propaganda euphorically hyped the war-related boom as an armaments miracle. The upswing was initiated by Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments. However, when Todt became critical of the course of the war, a rift with Hitler ensued. On February 8, 1942, the civil engineer was killed in a plane crash at the Rastenburg airport near the Führer's headquarters, Wolfschanz. Hitler ordered a state funeral and posthumously awarded Todt the highest honor of the National Socialist Reich, the Teutonic Order. A few hours after Todt's death, Adolf Hitler appointed his favorite architect as his successor.
Albert Speer was a gifted manager, and above all, he had the advantage of having direct access to Hitler. He was able to achieve things organizationally that Fritz Todt had also conceived, but also always wanted, had also set on the right path, but only Speer could achieve that. His relationship with Hitler was a very special one. So he got the recognition, became armaments minister with a spectrum of control that Todt had never dreamed of. And he was capable in organizing armaments. But this armaments miracle that many talked about had not really been a miracle, but was a very normal process of switching from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy.
Von Friedens- auf Kriegswirtschaft.
Albert Speer succeeded in increasing production output in some areas of armaments. He also knew how to market himself and his successes effectively for propaganda purposes. In fact, German armaments lagged far behind the achievements of the Allied armaments manufacturers, a fact that Hitler also studiously ignored.
The most important first measures that Speer took during his first weeks were above all displays of staging and propaganda. So now he had the so-called home front propaganda, which systematically referred to the production miracles and the achievements of the German armaments industry, and which then very soon became intoxicated with its own successes.
In einer großen Waffenschmiede des Reiches sprach der Führer zu allen deutschen Rüstungsarbeitern. Die Gefolgschaft des Werkes versammelte sich in einer riesigen Montagehalle, in der aus mächtigen Stahl- und Eisenblöcken eine Rednertribüne aufgebaut war.
In view of these supposed successes, even the majority of the traditionally left-wing working class agreed with the regime.
Lange Zeit hat man angenommen, dass die Arbeiterbewegung.
For a long time, it was assumed that the workers' movement, especially in the cities where there was a high proportion of workers, actually had a particularly high level of resistance to the Nazis.
Das würde man heute so sicherlich nicht mehr aufrechterhalten. Fakt ist,
obviously, that's not what we think today anymore. The fact is that the Nazi dictatorship was a dictatorship of consent, a consensus dictatorship. There was certainly resistance, but that was clearly a smaller part of the civilian population. And there was a high level of willingness, especially because many who had actually lived in economically difficult circumstances in the 1920s or at the beginning of the 1930s were subjectively better off and actually benefited from the racist system. And it was not just through rearmament and through the boosting of arms production, but also overall, at least for a segment of the population, there were better economic conditions, and thereby the approval also rose.
As the war progressed, more and more workers, which Speer needed, were sent to the front. On Hitler's behalf, Fritz Sauckel planned the importation of millions of forced laborers to the Reich for use in the armaments industry and agriculture. First of all, volunteers were recruited. Za granica, or abroad, the Polish workers and agricultural laborers were promised land, or that's what German propaganda promised. There was no discussion of endless shifts in dangerous production factories in the armaments industry, but of work in Volkswagen factories, including rations and full pay packets. In truth, they were fed and paid less than German workers. If any of these so-called foreign or Eastern workers objected, they were threatened with imprisonment in a concentration camp.
Am Anfang gab es ja durchaus auch den Versuch,
in the beginning, there was an attempt to find volunteer workers and bring them to Germany. They realized very quickly that this would in no way bring the masses that were needed. In this respect, they very quickly turned to coercive measures through work obligations, but also through so-called forcible recruitment. That is, people were simply taken off the streets in the occupied areas, out of restaurants, out of cinemas, out of houses, by force.
Children were regarded as useless mouths to feed. Even babies born in Germany to so-called Eastern workers were deliberately left to starve. The Germans subjected up to 11 million people to forced labor. In no other National Socialist crime were so many involved as victims, perpetrators, or spectators. Speer operated his industries with forced laborers from concentration camps until the end of the war.
For
Speer, the forced laborers were war material. That is, it was a matter of getting as many able-bodied people as possible into war production. And indeed, the more the war progressed, and the more difficult, in practical terms, the requirement was to supply this war material, the more brutal the recruiting measures became.
Forced laborers used in agriculture often came from Poland. They were strictly forbidden to associate with German women. Anyone who did was denounced and, at the least, faced public humiliation.
The whole thing was organized. It was not spontaneous anger that broke out, but these women were usually denounced. And if these women were convicted, it could lead to prison sentences, or mostly to concentration camp sentences. And these sentences were usually accompanied by public humiliation, which was clearly intended to really affect the social dignity of the women. For example, by cutting their hair off completely, putting a sign on them, taking pictures with them, leading them through the whole village. Sometimes there were also violent attacks, but it was all organized. For example, the BDM, the National Socialist Women's Society, was involved. It was not something that sprang spontaneously from the population.
Until March of 1942, the Hanseatic city of Lübeck had been largely spared the direct effects of the war. Unlike the Reich capital Berlin, no Allied bombs had fallen there yet. The medieval alleys of the old town still stood untouched, despite the nearby submarine shipyard at Travemünde Harbor and its relatively good accessibility for the Royal Air Force flying units. Up until February 1942, they had been subjected to the so-called Area Bombing Directive. The aim of the attacks were to break the morale of the German civilian population by any means, especially that of the industrial workers. The new commander-in-chief, Arthur Harris, was explicitly told that the targets were to be built-up areas and not, for example, shipyards or aircraft factories. On the starry moonlit night of March 29th, the British dropped their deadly load over Lübeck. After the area bombardment, Thomas Mann's birthplace was in flames. The exile had no knowledge of the new directive.
Beim jüngsten britischen Raid über Hitlerland hat das alte Lübeck zu leiden gehabt. Das geht mich an. Es ist meine Vaterstadt. Die Angriffe galten dem Hafen von Travemünde, den kriegsindustriellen Anlagen dort. Aber es hat Brände gegeben in der Stadt. Aber ich denke an Coventry und habe nichts einzuwenden gegen die Lehre, dass alles bezahlt werden muss.
320 people were killed in the firestorm. But contrary to Thomas Mann's suspicions, the attacks were not motivated by a desire for retribution, but were calculated. The next area bombardment was to be Rostock.
Why Lübeck and Rostock in particular? Both were Hanseatic cities that had an easily combustible inner city core, and they were located by the sea and were therefore easy to find. The interesting thing, Lübeck was also a military target. Submarines were built in Lübeck in the Flander factories, but they didn't attack the Flander factories, they attacked the medieval old town. And it was the same in Rostock and other cities later. The plan was to attack about 50 German cities, burn them down and kill about 900,000 civilians. This was done to cause chaos in Germany, because the British argument was that no state would exist without its cities. These were administrative centers, economic centers. When the population fled from the cities, when there were no more administrative centers, there would be chaos. And then the Germans would start a revolution, an uprising, like they did in 1918.
But this did not happen. On the contrary, the population showed solidarity with the Nazi regime, which immediately provided aid. The National Socialist People's Welfare Organization provided free accommodation and food.
Dass dieser Effekt nicht eingetreten
The fact that this effect did not occur, that the bombing didn't lower the morale of the civilian population so that it could possibly lead to an uprising,
ich glaube, das ist eine
I think that was a great misjudgment on the part of the British Army.
Der britischen Armee gewesen, denn
because most of the German civilians accepted their situation because they believed that it was their duty, it was their contribution, what they had to endure in this war. They compared themselves to soldiers who had to endure the same at the fronts. And this Volksgemeinschaft understood itself as a community at war, as a wartime society.
Verstanden, als eine Kriegsgesellschaft.
U.S. bomber squadrons also flew attacks on Nazi Germany from the United Kingdom. With their flying fortresses, from summer 1942 onward, they attacked mainly during the day, primarily industrial targets and infrastructure. A Boeing B-17 is capable of carrying more than 4,000 kilograms of bombs. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill did express reservations about his own strategy, but didn't change it.
Once they started with their bombing directive, they didn't divert from that because that would have meant questioning what you had done in the years before. So they collected intelligence that confirmed the strategy and left out other intelligence. So the classic case of intelligence failure or politically directed intelligence work that always confirmed only what they wanted to hear. And so British intelligence services reported that next fall, next spring, the Germans would collapse. So this began in February 1942, that the Bomber Command, the attacks almost completely concentrated on attacking the German inner cities and burning them down, attacking especially the neighborhoods where the German industrial workers lived, who they wanted to hit, and they wanted to kill in order to cause chaos. And in turn to hit the industrial production in order to end the war with that.
One of the favorite targets of the British bomber squadrons was Cologne. Because of its geographical location, it was relatively easy to reach. Camera crews of the Ministry of Propaganda made films about the heavily hit city center after the so-called 1,000-bomber raid on the night of May 31st. The face of the cathedral city had been changed overnight. Almost 500 people died and 45,000 were homeless.
That's also what's special about the bombing directive that was issued there in February of 1942, because it changed the target, changed the intent. It wasn't, if we kill civilians, they just die, but civilians then became the main target. And that's what made that directive in February 1942 so special.
Meanwhile, at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler and his entourage were safe from such attacks in the Berghof. Italy's Duce, Benito Mussolini, arrived for a visit at the end of April. For the newsreels, the two dictators demonstrated unity and strength. To regain the lost initiative in the war against the Soviet Union, Hitler had planned a summer offensive. Units of his ally also fought on the Eastern Front.
In der südlichen Ukraine. Italienische Verbände greifen ein von den Sowjets hartnäckig verteidigtes Dorf an.
In the previous year, the Axis attacks had stalled at the fronts of Leningrad, Moscow, and Sevastopol. Then, Army Group South, supported by Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian units, was to go on the offensive again. Since October 1941, the Third Army, supported by Hungarian troops, had been besieging the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Only at the end of June 1942, after heavy fighting, did the defeat of the Soviet defenders become apparent. The way to the south was free. Then, the German advance was directed towards the Caucasus. From Kharkov, the troops were to advance in the direction of Baku. Hitler had long since decided to exploit the Soviet Union along colonial lines, as one memorandum put it. But the circumstances were unfavorable. The bloodied Wehrmacht could no longer operate with 3 army groups as it had the year before. It was only capable of advancing in a single direction.
When the Germans began their summer offensive in 1942, the target was the Caucasus and the Soviet oil. And this goal made sense because 90% of Soviet oil was in the Caucasus. If they conquered that, they would have had access to it themselves, and most importantly, they would cut off the Soviets from it. There was relatively little oil in the Urals, so that would have been a real armament blow to the Soviet Union.
In May, the Germans had repulsed a Soviet offensive near Kharkov and occupied the city. An officer documented the everyday life of the occupation in the eastern Ukrainian metropolis. The Germans then had an opportunity to systematically put their criminal plans into practice. Numerous inhabitants of the city had already been deported to Germany for forced labor. Then the deportations to the death camps began.
Beginning in June of 1941, with the start of the war against the Soviet Union, they already had in advance the criminal orders. That is, those orders that were agreed on between the Reich government, the Nazi government, and the military leadership. So there was already a clear option. And corresponding orders were also issued, that this war would be a special war, a world war, a war of extermination, for which certain regulations of international law, which were supposed to limit the war and its dynamics of violence, were suspended. And there was a difference between the Wehrmacht advancing forward and an occupation regime in the various sub-areas, which is, after all, a military occupation in the beginning. And then later on it turned into a civil administration, through which also the persecution of political opponents, but also of the Jewish population, actually ran more administratively.
The victory at Kharkov was one of the last successful encirclement battles fought by the Germans. The forces earmarked for the Soviet Spring Offensive were annihilated. Some 240,000 Soviet soldiers went into captivity and to a horrible fate.
Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers died in the Nazi camps. And you can say that these people were systematically killed by hunger. You can't say that that was a result of malnutrition or lack of supplies, but rather that those prisoners of war were deliberately and intentionally driven to their deaths. Numerous prisoners of war were in Auschwitz and were killed there, and the first experiments of using gas to kill people were made using Soviet prisoners of war. And word got around in the Red Army. That's why the number of defectors and prisoners of war decreased, because word got out about how Red Army soldiers were treated in Germany. That's when the chance of survival ended up being greater in Red Army units than in German camps.
In the spring of 1942, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels visited one such POW camp. The agitator knew how to use the desperate situation of the Soviet Union, invaded by the Germans, for his perfidious propaganda and portrayed the defeated as subhumans. He no longer had any great illusions about the course of the war.
Goebbels was the most realistic of all of them. For him, it was pretty clear that the matter was over, that they weren't going to win anymore, but that they had a great chance to implement their murderous program now, because they all had to participate. You could also say that from 1942 on, the regime had no interest in anything else than to implement this great program of extermination. To accomplish this, any means were acceptable.
The main executors of the regime's extermination plans were Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. Since the beginning of the war, they had already murdered tens of thousands, mainly by shooting. That was when the mass crimes were systematized with German thoroughness. The civil servants appointed by the regime to administer the killing met in a villa on Wannsee in January to lay down the justification for it, the so-called Wannsee Protocol. It was recorded how many people one intended to kill: 11 million.
The decision that European Jews should be completely and systematically murdered had been made at that time. And in this respect, it was the task of this institution, within the framework of its competence to act, to implement this. And this was practically the translation of this ideological political will into an administrative challenge. Also discussed was the question of the deportation of German and Western European Jews to the ghettos and to the camps in the East. All that was the subject of this conference.
The so-called final solution of the Jewish question, as it was called in the jargon of the National Socialists, had become a concrete program. The plan for the genocide of the Jews stipulated how many people should be deported, in what period of time, and by what means they were to be killed. The Auschwitz concentration camp in occupied Poland was now expanded to become the largest Nazi death camp. SS Chief Himmler personally saw to the expansion of these camps. The killing factories were to relieve the overcrowded ghettos and camps where epidemics and starvation were rampant. The regime wanted to bring the killing of the undesirables back under its control.
The pressure came from the ghettos and the camps. The pressure came from those responsible. They could no longer continue to operate this way. This, of course, created a compulsion to act, in their logic at least. And from that, we now understand that this very search for more efficient killing methods very quickly came to putting this effective killing machinery in motion, with Zyklon B in the gas chambers.
The name Auschwitz became a worldwide symbol of Nazi terror and genocide. By the end of the war, an estimated 1.5 million people had died in Auschwitz from gas, hunger, and disease. Meanwhile, Goebbels exhorted the Germans on the home front, warning anyone who was a thorn in the side of the Nazi dictatorship, be it the Soviet population, Jews, opponents of the regime, or even dissidents. There was hardly any opposition. Fear of Gestapo terror and imprisonment silenced many critics of the war. In May of 1942, a propaganda exhibition, The Soviet Paradise, opened in Berlin with a staged mass spectacle. The film, produced especially for the show, mocked the Russian population that had been impoverished by war and destruction.
Mit dem siegreichen Vormarsch unserer Truppen konnten Kriegsberichter tief beeindruckt vom Sowjetparadies, das ihnen nun in seinem hoffnungslosen und grauen Alltag offen lag, ausschnittartig aufnehmen, was sie während der Fahrtpausen sahen.
Not everyone believed the grotesque phrases. Nevertheless, the propaganda of hate was having an effect.
One could already see, for example, in letters from the field, that propaganda was often believed by what the letter writers themselves had already accepted as stereotypical images of the enemy. Then, very often, they also believed what the propaganda represented. As far as the Soviet Union was concerned, it must be said that many soldiers who participated in the war, especially during the invasion after June 1941, believed the stereotypes that existed in German propaganda, namely that they were subhumans, and that there was a high degree of willingness to reproduce these images. There we can also see how the integration into the declared goals of the war of extermination, that we were dealing with a war that from the very beginning aimed not only to win militarily, but to actually radically destroy this enemy.
Sondern diesen Feind tatsächlich radikal zu vernichten.
Das ist unser Vorsprung. Die unnachahmbare Haltung deutscher Soldaten, ihre Kühnheit, ihr Angriffsgeist, ihre Zuverlässigkeit. Diesen deutschen Soldaten geht in vorbildlichem Führertum der deutsche Offizier voran, als Träger der Waffenausbildung und der Kampfmoral und als Garant unseres Vorsprungs, den kein Feindstaat mehr einholen kann, des sieghaften Geistes deutschen Soldatentums.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the fortunes of war initially seemed to be on the side of the Japanese. The U.S. base in the Philippines was now the focus of the Japanese Empire. Since the turn of the century, the United States had had a naval base in the archipelago. There were numerous bomber squadrons stationed there, but technically obsolete. Some of the weapons technology also dated back to the First World War. The exiled Americans led a colonial-style life in the Philippines and did not seem to expect an attack until Japanese troops attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. One day after the raid, Japan attacked the Philippines. The capital, Manila, had fallen on January 2, 1942. During the occupation, Japanese troops committed horrific atrocities against the civilian population in a city that was almost completely destroyed. The U.S. troops retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. In April, they surrendered. About 60,000 American soldiers became Japanese prisoners of war.
The Japanese military committed a great number of war crimes during World War II, and one of the main victim groups were white Anglo-Americans, as were Australian soldiers, prisoners of war, who were considered inferior by the Japanese soldiers because of racial views.
Aufgrund von rassistischen und rassischen Anschauungen als minderwertig betrachtet wurden.
The prisoners had to march more than 100 kilometers in the blazing sun. Their destination was a railroad station from which they were transported to a prisoner of war camp.
On the Japanese side, these soldiers were not provided for at all. There was almost no food, nothing to drink, or only insufficient. And in addition, these soldiers were also physically maltreated, were beaten, were chastised. Some were also shot, or if someone lay down at the roadside because he could not march on, then he was simply beaten to death on the spot or shot. Out of 60,000 soldiers, more than 10,000 certainly died in the Bataan Death March. After all, these soldiers all ended up in Japanese captivity, continued to be mistreated in captivity for weeks, months, years. And of those soldiers embarked on the Bataan Death March, only 15,000 returned home when the war ended.
Nach dem Ende des Krieges nur noch 15.000 in die Heimat zurückgekehrt.
In April, an aircraft carrier with a squadron of bombers on board set out from the United States for the Pacific. President Roosevelt did everything he could to stop the Japanese advance. A surprise military strike was planned to put the empire in its place.
It happened in the spring of 1942, the so-called Doolittle raids. That was an air raid on Japan's capital, Tokyo. It was intended to send a clear message to the Japanese army. You are now in danger. We are now going on the offensive, and we are in a position not only to somehow attack a peripheral part of the Japanese empire, but we are in a position to strike at the heart of Japan, to go all the way to the seat of the Japanese emperor and bomb Tokyo.
Mobilization against Japan was also taking place on the home front. Racism fomented by the propaganda broke through unchecked. Since Pearl Harbor, all U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry were considered a security risk. Far away from civilization, the first internment camps were built on American soil. They consisted of barren barracks and were guarded by U.S. soldiers.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, including people who had American passports, were transferred to relocation camps, not only in the United States but also in Canada. And in a way, it was a continuation of an anti-Japanese, anti-Asian policy that had been pursued in the US even before the Second World War. That must not be forgotten. This also showed, in a certain respect, this racist way of thinking, which was also definitely present on the part of the Americans. In addition, of course, there was a certain idea that people were saying, you have to lock these people up now, because they could be used by the Japanese side as informers. They could somehow spy around. They could somehow infiltrate American society. They presented a danger.
120,000 men, women, and children were sent to those camps. Enemy alien was their official title. Those who refused went to prison for years.
Interestingly enough, in the relocation camps, Japanese Americans really fought for recognition by saying, "We want to go to war on the American side too." For a long time, the American side did not allow this. Roosevelt had no interest in it for a long time.
In 1944, the internments were declared unconstitutional. The victims, however, had to wait almost 50 years for an apology. Midway Island in the Central Pacific was home to the farthest western outpost of the United States. The U.S. Navy Air Base was located right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean between Japan and California. The 6-square-kilometer atoll consisted mainly of 3 runways. To wage war across the Pacific against Japan, aircraft carriers and their bomber squadrons played the most important role. Each existing airfield represented an important strategic advantage.
In the spring of 1942, American forces were increasingly trying to go on the offensive in the Asia-Pacific region, to now take the initiative, to take the scepter, so to say, militarily out of Japan's hands. And the Japanese, on the other hand, were toying with the idea of not only further consolidating the conquered territories there, but possibly making up for the missed landing in Hawaii after all.
Unlike the attack on Pearl Harbor, this time the Americans were prepared. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese fighter squadrons attacked Midway. They bombarded the 2 islands for 20 minutes. But the Americans were expecting the Japanese fleet. They had cracked the Japanese radio codes and thus identified the target of the attack in advance. The commanders had assembled as many aircraft carriers as possible at Midway.
At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Navy lost 4 of 6 aircraft carriers. You have to remember that the American war effort had a lot more battleships and many more aircraft carriers in the pipeline compared to Japan. Japan couldn't keep up in any way with the US armor-wise, and that's why the Battle of Midway represented a turning point in the Pacific War.
The Japanese suffered heavy losses. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers died in that battle.
There was also the aspect of not only aircraft carriers being lost in the Battle of Midway, perhaps more importantly for the Japanese Empire, the very well-trained Japanese pilots who had war experience, who had also been on the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many of those pilots were killed there.
The Battle of Midway was a successful payback for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advance had been halted. Nevertheless, it was clear that the soldiers still had a long, blood-soaked road ahead of them to Tokyo. At that point, however, no one suspected the final extent to which the slaughter would go. The dying in the Pacific would continue for 3 more years and cost the lives of tens of thousands of GIs.